Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome in from a somewhat dreary day, at least in terms of weather, but I'm quite excited for you to be here and for myself. I've enjoyed a nice afternoon with our guest, and I'm very excited about this topic and the conversation that Michael Roth is here to lead us in. Washington College's Phi Beta Kappa chapter, Theta of Maryland, is celebrating its 10th anniversary this year. In a couple of weeks, we will officially induct our 10th class of highest achieving seniors into the nation's oldest and most prestigious honor society, one focused on achievement not in a single major or special area of study, but across the liberal arts and sciences, the very grammar and logic of this college. I'm proud to report that our chapter was this year nationally recognized as one of 2 outstanding chapters. That's good for 3 years. Phi Beta Kappa meets every 3 years, so we get to hold that for a while. For their work as officers of this chapter and their help in organizing this event and others, I want to thank my colleagues, Professors Elizabeth O'Connor, Julie Markin, Lauren Littlefield, and Phil Walsh. Next month, March 9, we will be co-sponsoring the lecture by Dr. Sherry Turkle, author of Reclaiming Conversation. Today, we are very pleased to have President Michael S. Roth join us for our Phi Beta Kappa address. This is part of a series of programs and discussions that our chapter has hosted over its first 10 years, a series that we could title Reclaiming the Conversation of Liberal Education. What's that conversation, and why is it in need of reclaiming? Ralph Waldo Emerson, a former Phi Beta Kappa speaker and an important figure in Professor Roth's history of an American pragmatic liberal education, suggests one answer. The world is all gates, he writes, all opportunities, strings of tension waiting to be struck. This is a meaningful and complex way to think of the world of liberal education, located in each college or university, the gates that open onto the experience of studying the universe of knowledge, but with the place and patience to do so thoughtfully, which means, to some extent, learning that takes place apart from the busy world beyond the gates. Yet at the same time, these same gates open back onto the public world with which the college or university converses. Like the note struck from a string, the opportunity lies in that tension. There is a drowning chorus of skepticism, as we all know, that assumes that the world of liberal education is all risk without reward. It doesn't have much patience for strings of tension. Like Emerson, Professor Roth knows that the relation and productive tension between the world inside and outside our gates is not only necessary to liberal education in this moment, particularly when the tradition is under devastating economic and social pressure, it is in fact one of its defining values. In reclaiming the tradition of Jefferson, Emerson, William James, Jane Addams, Du Bois, Dewey, and others, Professor Roth argues that we extend their conceptions of a broad, pragmatic liberal education, not simply because it is practical for us to do so, given our present times, but because it is meaningful to do so, given our history and our philosophy. Michael Roth is the 16th president of Wesleyan University, from which he received his undergraduate degree and graduated Phi Beta Kappa. After earning his PhD in history from Princeton University, he taught at Scripps College and Claremont Graduate University. He also served as the president of the California College of the Arts before returning to Wesleyan in 2007. His many publications include Psychoanalysis as History, Negation and Freedom in Freud, Memory, Trauma and History, Essays on Living with the Past, and most recently, Beyond the University, Why Liberal Education Matters, which was just last month given the Ness Award by the AAC and you for a book that best illuminates the goals and practices of contemporary liberal education. After the address, we invite you to remain for reception. To continue the conversation, we'll also plan for some Q&A after President Roth finishes speaking. We have his book available for those of you that have not yet taken a look at it. I do encourage you to, in my view, it's one of the best out there on this topic. There are a lot of them, not all as good as this one. So please join me in welcoming through the gates of Washington College our very distinguished guest, President Michael Roth.
Thank you for coming out on this dreary day, and this rainy day. It's great to see you here, and it's great to be at an official Phi Beta Kappa event. I am going to go back to the chapter at Wesleyan and say that we should be doing more in the line of contributing to the intellectual character of our school, as you are doing here. I am also delighted to be at an official Phi Beta Kappa event because I missed my own Phi Beta Kappa ceremony in 1978. I was preparing to graduate from Wesleyan. I don't know how it is here. You're probably a very studious bunch, but at Wesleyan in the 70s, the last week of the last semester of one's collegiate career was full of many things, but studying wasn't among them. And for a nerdy guy like me, it was really something to look forward to, and I had this Phi Beta Kappa induction ceremony coming up, and I was going to have to do nothing but stay awake for that. And I got a call from my parents and said, "You can't go to this thing. You can't go to this Phi Beta whatever. You have to go to your cousin's bar mitzvah in Brooklyn." Scotty Getz was getting bar mitzvahed in Brooklyn. I was like, "Mom, it's Phi Beta Kappa. I get a key." She said, "You're already in a fraternity." And so I went to Brooklyn, where I had to, be awake and drive and all the rest. So I always, every year, now that I'm the president of Wesleyan, I get to tell that story to the Phi Beta Kappa inductees with pleasure. And it's a pleasure to talk with you today about a subject that is more controversial, perhaps, than it should be, liberal education. It seems like mom, apple pie, yet it's fraught, full of risk. People have trepidation about it. And I've been doing a lot of writing about liberal education over the last several years. I'm not an American historian, and I've talked to my American history friends about writing this book, and they were filled with trepidation, actually, because I'm a Europeanist. The more I got into the history of liberal education in the United States, the more surprising our own disaffection from the tradition astonished me. Now, we fancy people at colleges and universities, we don't like to say that usually. We like to say, well, what about Oxbridge? What about the Middle Ages? What about the Greeks? Liberal arts education goes back a long way. It does. Even I know that, an administrator. But liberal education, not liberal arts education, liberal education, pragmatic liberal education, is an American tradition. It's very distinct, I argue in this book, from the European tradition, and in ways, as you'll hear, characteristically, I think, American, and something that should we lose, I'll give you the conclusion in the beginning. If we lose that tradition, we will become the call center of the world. We will be a place to which other countries outsource their work. We will be a place not of innovation, creativity, and productivity. We will be a place of backwater culture, inept politicians, and an increasingly stultified electorate. Does it sound like we're on the way? We are on the way. And so it is an important, if controversial, subject. I have 4 beats to my song. 4 beats to my song. And here they are. Liberate, animate, cooperate, and instigate. I was very proud of coming up with 4 words that rhymed. I was proud of this, not because I sat on the train for hours doing, but I was going to Beijing to talk about liberal education. Just about the time I finished the book, I was, actually before it came out, I was going to Beijing. I hadn't been to China maybe just once, very quickly for a Wesleyan thing. And they invited me to come and talk about liberal education. It was the Christmas vacation at the Peking University. They don't call it the Christmas vacation, it was the winter break. I expected 25 people. I got to the hall. It was very exciting. There was a huge banner on which they claimed it said Michael Roth, it's liberal education in Chinese characters. I believed them. I took a picture, sent it to my mother. See if I had gone to Phi Beta Kappa. And I got into the hallway, and there were a couple of hundred people there. Standing room only. They were very eager to hear about this. They knew, they said in the question and answer period, they knew that liberal education is what they needed because they had to get away from rote education. They had to get away from just following orders. We were talking about this just over coffee before. They wanted an education that stimulated creativity and innovation, and they knew they didn't have it. Well, I was excited. I saw this big group of people, so I sat there. I don't read, as you see now, I don't read papers anymore. I can tell you that story another time where I swore off that academic practice. And I sat there thinking, okay, I have to come up with something pretty exciting, and I came up with liberate, animate, cooperate, instigate. And I got up there to deliver my talk, very proud of myself, and then I realized that my interpreter, who would interrupt me after every 2 sentences, was going to make no effort to rhyme anything at all. So I use it now for you, the English version of this. So liberate. I'm going to start with Thomas Jefferson. I probably should have come up with a way of doing George Washington, who was in favor of a national university, but Jefferson's my man in the book, and more important, I have to say, for the history of liberal education in the United States, Thomas Jefferson, when he was thinking about how to start the University of Virginia, wanted to create a form of education that had one goal that was very important to him, and actually becomes important to anybody in higher education administration over the next couple hundred years. And that goal was not to wind up like the people at Harvard. And for Jefferson, what that meant was, at Harvard, when you started your education, you knew where you were going to wind up. You said, you're going to be a minister when you graduate, you're going to be in the professions, well, you wouldn't have been allowed to go. But you knew when you began what your major was going to be, we would say today. You knew the track you were on. So you knew where you were going to end up. And Jefferson said, what kind of education is that? An education that you know the answer before you've actually pursued the question. That's not education, that's indoctrination, or as my activist students like to say today, training. They want us all to have training at Wesleyan. But that's because they know the answer rather than more pursuing a question. Another subject for the Q&A, if you like. Jefferson thought education should be a liberation. In this regard, he was a classic Enlightenment guy. You know Kant, Immanuel Kant, the great German philosopher, identified or defined enlightenment as freedom from self-imposed immaturity. It's pretty good. Enlightenment is freedom from self-imposed immaturity. Jefferson thought that the process of enlightenment, and in this regard he was following Kant, the process of enlightenment should allow you to come into your own as a thinking, responsible person, individual. And that would happen through the unfettered exploration of new ideas. So Jefferson didn't want any religion taught at his university, right? Because he thought you could never have, with religious institutions on the campus, the unfettered exploration of ideas. He gave in a little bit. They put them on the outside, the campus, just the outer ring. But for him, science, inquiry, was at the heart of a liberal education. When Jefferson wrote to his frenemy, John Adams, about his project, he said, ours will be the follies of enthusiasm, but not of bigotry. It's a great phrase. Ours will be the follies of enthusiasm. I think of that a lot at Wesleyan. Late at night when I hear people in the street walking around studying, I think. I have to live on campus at Wesleyan as the president. I live across from the classics department. It's called Delta Kappa Epsilon. It's not really the classics department. Anyway, they're closed right now. But anyway, that's another story that the lawyers will not allow me to tell. But for Jefferson, what was so important was that your enthusiasm would generate learning. Whereas he thought at Harvard and in Europe, what happened was that the categorization of study was a hedge against enthusiasm, was a way of protecting people against getting too excited about what they were studying. And that science, inquiry, learning was so exciting that it would feed itself, that it would create an appetite for more and more learning. Ours will be the follies of enthusiasm. Now, you're probably thinking, really, Roth? Thomas Jefferson? And you're saying enthusiasm but not bigotry? Thomas Jefferson? Most audiences I go to, the first thing they hear when I say Thomas Jefferson is Sally Hemings. Most audiences, the first thing they think about when I say Thomas Jefferson is maybe hypocrisy. And now because of the musical Hamilton, maybe hypocrisy and condescension, right? As portrayed in that show in New York. So, and of course, that's true and important. Jefferson was a man of many prejudices. And as a historian, I have been trained to say that we should not judge him with the standards of our time, but we should use the standards of his time. And even by those standards, he was a racist bigot. He brought hypocrisy to another level, as many people around him pointed out again and again. And that is crucial to including Jefferson in the historical record. But nonetheless, it would be a tremendous mistake in the name of our own moral sensibility to exclude the Jeffersonian tradition of education as liberation because of his other faults. Because this tradition of education as liberation is crucial to the struggle for civil rights in the United States. Paradoxically, the next thinker I'm going to talk to you about under the rubric of liberate is David Walker, a free black living in the Boston area who wrote an appeal, famous text called The Appeal, which was a call for black slaves to throw off the chains of slavery, kill their masters, and escape. He took the tract and he sewed it into the clothes of travelers or merchant marines. A price was put on his head in some of the southern states, dead or alive, preferably alive so he could torture him to death. And Walker made the strong appeal that the path to freedom, the path to liberation, was the path of education. I'm going to give you a quote. The only note I have is this quote from Walker, because I don't want to dilute it or misstate it. Walker says, David Walker's appeal, 1829, for those of you who are keeping score. Are we not men, he writes? We are, because we can learn. This is also Jefferson, that we are, what makes us distinctly human is our capacity to learn. Not just to be trained. We know you can train a horse, you can train a dog, but we can learn. I pray that the Lord may undeceive my ignorant brethren, writes David Walker, and permit them to throw away pretensions and seek after the substance of learning. He's writing this for slaves. I would crawl on my hands and knees through mud and mire to the feet of a learned man, where I would sit and humbly supplicate him to instill into me that which neither devils nor tyrants could remove, only with my life. For colored people to acquire learning in this country makes tyrants quake and tremble on their sandy foundation. For colored people to acquire learning in this country makes tyrants quake and tremble on their sandy foundation. I still quote this in op-eds whenever I have the chance. Sometimes the newspaper editor says, "Didn't you quote that last time?" But I think it's still true. The bare name of educating, I'm quoting again, the bare name of educating the colored people scares our cruel oppressors almost to death. So Walker, in his appeal, says Jefferson is completely right about learning being the ticket to freedom. Education is liberation. But Jefferson said black people can't learn. And that's where Walker said Jefferson is our enemy. Because the path of learning is what makes freedom meaningful. Around the same time, a little later, Frederick Douglass sounds a similar note. Douglass says that when he was a slave in Baltimore, his mistress taught him to read the Bible. Mrs. Old, if I'm remembering right. A-U-L-D. And she taught him how to read a little bit from the Bible. And one day the master came. She calls him over, says, "Here, Freddie, come over here." I don't know if she called him Freddie, but she said, "Read from the Bible." Here's the Bible. Well, it's a little pretentious of me, but no. Read from the Bible. Sorry. Read from the Bible, and he starts reading from the Bible, not 2 Corinthians. That's good. You're reading about Trump. He reads from the Bible, and the master has a temper tantrum. Freddie runs under the table and hears the words that will ring in his ears for the rest of his life. He says to his wife, "You can't teach that boy to read. You can't teach that boy to read. He's black. He can't be taught to read." And she said, "Well, but no, actually, he was just reading the Bible. I did teach him." And he says, "You can't teach him to read. Reading will make him unfit for slavery." Reading will make him unfit for slavery. And this will be seared into his consciousness. Education is liberation. Douglass would later joke about this on the stump when he was giving speeches. He would say, "I don't know why they say Africans and African Americans can't read. Because in Alabama they have laws saying you can't teach black people to read. But if we can't read, why would they have a law saying you can't teach us to read? There's no law about teaching a cow not to read. There's no law you can't teach a pig to read. What's wrong with these people? Haven't they had enough education?" Education would set them free, as it had set Frederick Douglass free. That vision of education as liberation, the Jeffersonian vision, is core to the American tradition of liberal education. So that's our first beat. The other ones won't take so long, so don't worry. The second one is animate. Liberate to animate. Animate, it's simple in a way, and it's more subtle in another way. The person I want to use to talk about this is Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was famously spoken at Phi Beta Kappa addresses at Harvard. Emerson thought that the point of education is not to drill, but to set souls aflame, he famously said. Not to drill and to make you memorize things, but to set souls aflame. And what he meant by that was that education should make the world more alive for us because it gives us the ability to turn the world on, to make it more alive for us. Here, too, there's a Kantian dimension. That is, Kant thought that we made the world meaningful with our minds. Our minds were like space-time glasses through our minds, through the lenses of our minds, the world became meaningful to us, became organized by us, for us. Emerson thought that through education, real education, we would see the world as more vivacious than we had seen it before. And this, I'm sure, happens to you here at this college. That is, you take a music class, and you're like, yeah, I don't really like that kind of Chopin. I don't know, Chopin. I don't know. You know, Brecht said about Chopin, he was ill as a child, and they played Chopin too much in the next room, and it ruined his health forever. It just makes you just weak and oversensitive. So you look at that. You may not say that. You may say, I don't like Chopin. I like, I'm trying to think of a hip reference, and I can't. Macklemore. How's that? Is that okay? Is that somebody? Is there someone named Macklemore, or am I just making? There is? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So you say that, I don't like it, and then the professor, the gifted professor, says to you, here, put these headphones on, listen, and suddenly you're thinking, oh, maybe that happens, or maybe you say, yeah, I don't like Chopin. This makes me nervous. I had a teacher, Carl Shursky, just passed away some months ago at age 100, used to give a lecture on Wagner at Princeton when I was a graduate student. And he said, there's an extra lecture this week at night on Wagner. I was like, whoa, that sounds like fun. I had never gone to the opera. I don't know if I ever met anyone who had been to an opera. At least not that I knew of. But I was, kind of one of those students who would do anything for extra credit. So I went to this lecture. Carl Shursky was a brilliant teacher. And over the course of those few hours, I had fallen in love with this music. I mean, I just thought it was the greatest thing that had happened to me. I was over the moon with joy. Now, I had heard snippets of this, as you all have, without knowing it, of Wagner here and there. But suddenly, I heard it. There was more joy available to me in the world than there was before I went to that class. You could be studying astronomy, right? And suddenly you look at the sky, and the sky is different. You see things. The world is more alive. You animate the world, because if you're astronomy class, you take a business class and you realize what the merchant on Main Street is doing to provide jobs and stay afloat in your town, because you now see it's not just some business person trying to rip you off. This is a person whose work actually makes the community hang together in a sustainable way. In other words, your education gives you a context for making the world meaningful, alive to you. Your education allows you to animate, Emerson would say, the world. You know lots of people who go through the world like this, right? They are on a track. They think they know where they're going. And if they look to side, they will not get there as quickly. Emerson thought that those kinds of blinders in the name of efficiency were anti-human. That somehow opening up the possibilities of finding more life on our planet, not on other planets, on our planet, more aliveness was what education should provide. Animate the world. So we have liberate, we have animate. The third term is cooperate. So here I have in my book, I talk about a bunch of people, but let me today talk about Jane Addams. Jane Addams, who came of age in the late 1800s in Illinois. She was the daughter of a notable, a Republican Party, not rising star so much as donor, I guess, and elite person. Not super rich, but rich enough. And Jane Addams was his darling daughter, and she was really smart. And she wanted to go to Smith, get a good education. There weren't that many great places to go for smart girl, go to a women's college, get a great education, become a doctor. That was her plan. She told her dad said, you can't do that, you're a girl, sorry. You're a girl, you're kind of nervous. This is what they used to say in the 19th century, you'd say nervous. Today you'd say, what would you say? What would you say for nervous today without getting sued? I'll let you say it. What would you say if someone is a little, in the 19th century you'd say, you're a little nervous. What would you say today? Anyone? No? Headstrong? No, I don't think headstrong is, no, it's not headstrong. It's got, because high-strung, yes, you're a little high-strung. That's a kind of old-fashioned phrase, too. Yeah, high-strung. I'm getting medicated because I'm high-strung. We'd say something, right? We'd have to pathologize it a little bit more. But high-strung is very much like that, nervous. Anything else? Anybody else come to mind? Uptight. In my day, we would have said neurotic, but I don't think we say that. The old Freudians, we would just say, it's neurotic. Sorry? Flaky? Well, that's at Wesleyan. We take that as a compliment, so I don't know. But yes, but headstrong, flaky, neurotic. She was fragile, right? And so her dad said, go to this convent school. They'll take good care of you. You won't have much risk. You'll have a decent education. And she says, okay, I'll go to the convent school. I'll show you who's fragile. So she got on the newspaper. She became a campus leader. She aced all her classes. She's the top of her class. And so she comes home and she says, not fragile Jane anymore. Look at me. I've got, all of these accolades from my teachers. I'm doing great. I want to go to Smith and become a doctor. And Dad says, well, you're still a girl. I don't know. And so she's rather disappointed, but guess what happens? He dies. The father dies. And you might think Jane Addams would say, oh, all right, I'm off to Smith. She inherits all this money. She's fly. Is that what we say? Now? Fly? No. She's got money. All right, I'll stop. Sorry. She has money. She's going to go to Smith, but no, that's not what happens. Before I wrote this book, I spent most of my scholarly career on Sigmund Freud, and so it was no surprise to me that when she finds out her father's dead and she has all the money, she does exactly what her father said she should do, which was to do the womanly thing and not go on for higher education. In other words, as all the Freudians know, the most powerful father is a dead father. It usually gets a laugh. In New York, people laugh at that. I don't know. All right, so that she obeys her father because guilt and the rest makes that very important. And so she takes some money, she takes some friends, and she goes on a more traditional education, grand tour kind of thing. She goes to Europe. She's a deep reader. She's learning a lot of stuff. She's going to museums and the like. And one day, she is walking across the street in London. She's on the road. A guy is going to walk right in front of a cab, a horse-drawn cab, and he does, and he's knocked to the ground, and there's a great commotion, and he's seriously hurt. And what does Jane do? She thinks of a poem of de Musset in which there is an allusion, a very delicate allusion, to some verses of Homer in which there is a reference to an accident during which a spectator fails to respond. And she does this, and immediately, or as immediately as one could, realizes that all of this education she has had has made her less likely to do the right thing in the world, which is to lend a hand or to call for help. And she writes about this. She says, I have lumbered my mind with literature. I have lumbered my mind with literature, making myself less likely to act in the world. What kind of education could that be? I am thoughtful in exactly the wrong way. I think instead of act. She packs up her stuff. I abbreviate, this is the Hollywood version. She packs up her stuff and she heads back to the States. She goes to Chicago. She founds Hull House, the first kind of social work institution in the most vulnerable parts of the city, where she works with immigrants and poor people. And I say works with, not to help them or for them, but to work with them in a joint social work educative mission based in cooperation, because she comes to think it's through cooperation around the issues that most matter to the most vulnerable that education takes place. Education takes place through cooperation with the most vulnerable people about the issues that matter most to them. Not de Musset's allusion to Homer. She writes about this herself in a brilliant and beautiful essay called The Modern Lear, an essay which is about the failure of empathy, what we would call empathy today. She wonders why Lear, this way she, in a way, precursor to Stanley Cavell, wrote a beautiful essay on this too, why Lear clearly could know what Cordelia is really doing, doesn't want to know what she's really doing. You remember the beginning of Lear, perhaps that the three sisters are asked by the king to say, to profess their love for their father, three sisters, and that two of them are rotten, as my mother would say. They're rotten kids. And they, of course, get up and say, I love you, Father, I love you so much, can I have more of your kingdom? In Shakespearean, I just translate. And Cordelia refuses to speak. He refuses to play the game. And Lear knows quite well, he could know, but for trying, that the reason she will not speak is because she loves him in ways that cannot be put into the words of this game. And yet he refuses to see things, or is prevented to see things from her point of view. And so what she writes about in The Modern Lear, what Jane Addams writes about, is how often we have obstacles that prevent us from seeing things from another's point of view when it's right there in front of us. And she writes this about a labor battle that was going on in the early 20th century. What Jane Addams underscores by identifying education with cooperation, especially in regard to the most vulnerable, is the pragmatist perspective on education. Jane Addams was a fan of, and in some ways a student of William James, and he was a great fan of hers. You know, James said that in his remarks to teachers that one of the most difficult things to do in education, especially as you get further along in it, is to learn to see things from someone else's point of view. He says, how do we overcome a certain blindness, we philosophers, we professors? We think our blindness is a sign of our intelligence rather than a failure of our humanity. James writes, Harvard professor, philosopher, psychologist, and high-strung, as he undoubtedly was. Dewey meets Jane Addams and falls in love with her project. Dewey, John Dewey, another hero of mine in this book, who underscores that what's so important about Jane Addams's work is that she takes she takes away the emphasis on the individual. See, for Jefferson, it was so key to have liberation of the individual so you could stand on your own 2 feet. Freedom from self-imposed immaturity. Remember that phrase I gave you from Kant. For Emerson, learning to animate the world was similarly an individual consciousness. Dewey says, American individualism is our great national pathology. We insist that children learn to do things on their own. And that insistence turns them into little monsters at times. because it instructs them to not seek or ask for help, when that is one of the most important things to learn how to do. Cooperation should be at the heart of education. This is happening in contemporary liberal education. We talked about this just before the lecture. Group projects, teamwork, what people are wanting to find in the business world and in scholarship and in science. And Dewey put this at the heart of his theory of education, elementary school education, junior high school education. Dewey thought that any subject could be taught in a liberal education mode. In other words, you didn't have to have classics. You didn't have to have religion. You didn't have to have anything in particular. You could teach classics in a technical mode. You could teach music in a technical mode. And you could teach business in a liberal mode. The point was, were you teaching your subject with attention to context and concept? Were you teaching it in such a way as to open the path for further inquiry, or to shut it down in the name of efficiency and training? If you were shutting it down in the name of efficiency and training, it wasn't liberal education, it was training. But you could teach someone how to be an auto mechanic in a way that that person also learned something about how cars are produced and the function of the automobile industry in America. Or you can teach them just how to change the muffler. For Dewey, it wasn't about discipline. It wasn't about subject matter. It was about a capacious approach underscoring context and concept. So we've done liberate. Well, done is probably an overstatement. But we've introduced liberate, animate, cooperate. I think I have one more left. Instigate. And I'll be brief about this, because as a college president, I shouldn't really be instigating as much as I used to as a professor. But I take the word from Richard Rorty, a teacher I had at Princeton and a philosopher whose work has remained very important to me. And also, I just don't want to use the word innovate, because it would be too popular. Instigate, Rorty said, was important, because what should happen in elementary school and high school is that students should soak up the culture. They should acquire the culture around them. In mathematics and science and history and literature and languages, they should be steeped in what we know, or what we think we know, what passes for knowledge at any given time. What should happen at a college or university is that students should be instigated to rebel against what we think we know. Because if, in fact, college and university students simply follow in the path of their professors, no matter how critical the professors or radical the professors think they are, what they are getting is more training. And what they should get is a space, safe or not, to instigate changes in the way we think about what we know. Changes in the way we frame questions, changes in the way we prioritize issues, changes in the way we think about knowledge. Colleges and universities should be places of creativity through instigating rebellion against the status quo. It's hard when you're a professor to instigate rebellion against yourself, right? On the other hand, it's not that hard to create a space for students to launch on that process themselves. Why is that so important? It's so important because that underscores that liberal education is never over. It's not like you get to a certain point and you can stop the process of liberation or animation. You've gotten enough cooperation. No, it's never over, because your education should lead you to question the very terms of your knowledge, of your learning. And that instigation is the final frame or beat of my story, is meant to underscore that students, through a liberal education, will change the nature of the very story about liberal education and the good it can do. Or, absent that, liberal education will become general education requirements that you just check off. Where I used to teach, I'll do it that way, where I used to teach, we called that course Moons for Goons. It was an astronomy course, right? There was Rocks for Jocks, the geology course. You know these courses. At Wesleyan, I could do it here. We're far away from Connecticut. It's called Physics for Presidents. Funny how much of the appeals for cheating came from that class. Were they more dishonest in that class? No, but I think that students realized that the class itself was dishonest in a way. Check it off, you've done your science. Check it off, you've done your literature. Check it off, you've had 2 semesters of language, completely useless. After 2 semesters of a language, you can't read a newspaper. Useless. Sorry. But if you're going to have an education that's contextual and conceptual, it will lead you to ask more questions and continue learning. Today, we have a chorus of people who say, we can't afford that anymore. It's a competitive world out there, Roth. We need people who can code. I spend a lot of time with people who've made a lot of money coding or hiring coders or investing in people who hire coders. As much time as I possibly can, frankly, because I need them to give me money. I've yet to meet one of them who said, I'm sending my son or daughter to the coding academy instead of a fine college or university. Oh, they think other people should go there. Why should you have a liberal education? You would be better off, fill in the blank. You're a poor kid, you shouldn't have that. You're a woman, you shouldn't have this. You're from a different country, this is not appropriate for you. That is the language of using education to cement social and economic privilege. It is the language all too current on the campaign trail today, whether it's Professor Obama saying, well, we don't really need any more art historians, or Schoolmistress Rubio. Wasn't it he who idiotically thought welders made more money than philosophers? The point is that the anti-intellectualism in America is bound up with social class and economic privilege. And this is what Jefferson knew. And this is what Washington knew. I got a Washington reference in. Washington wanted a national university that was supported by the Congress so that people without economic means could get a university or college-level education. Jefferson said in his inimitable language, he wanted to rake the rubbish to find talented people among the poor. Why? Because they both thought that if you didn't do that, wealthy people would use their wealth to protect their children, making sure that they had the very best education, no matter how dumb they were, and that talented poor people would never have a chance. The result would be a stifled culture and a less productive economy, and a government that increasingly catered to the whims of the rich because they would be beholden to their economic power, making the government less and less capable of doing anything significant except padding the wallets of the wealthy. I was talking about the 18th century, but I could be talking about today. In our lifetimes, those of us who are the age of being out of school, we've seen a shift in the funding of education in this country, making it much more likely that education will cement social privilege rather than be an avenue for social mobility. It's crazy to blame people with money for this. I gave my daughter a tutor when she had to take the SATs. I think it's terrible. Wesleyan doesn't have SATs required anymore. That I could do, but my daughter was applying to other schools, so I got her a tutor. Even though what I'm telling you now is that's terrible. It makes the SAT a joke, which it is. But so you can't depend on people like me to say, well, I should do the right thing and make Sophie compete like any poor kid in Connecticut. I'm not going to do that with my daughter. But you could expect the public authorities to do its job to provide a public education to those talented enough to benefit from it, regardless of their ability to pay. This has been a principle fought for in this country ever since the Revolution. Not always won, but people were fighting it. George Washington and Thomas Jefferson fought for this. If we lose the conversation around liberal education as a vehicle for social mobility, it'll be disastrous not only for our economy and our culture, it'll be disastrous for our democracy. There's a lot at stake in liberate, animate, cooperate, and instigate. There's a lot of potential in the kind of education we have developed over time in the United States. Let us not squander it. Let us not squander it. Thank you. Yes, please.
Why bother dropping $200,000 on a national college education instead of following the footsteps of, like, going hippie and watering and traveling and actually learning through experience rather than in a classroom?
So the question is why put down a couple $100,000 on a college education rather than going hippie and going around the country and learning like the Jane Addams version, but the one without money. The Volkswagen bus version, or used to do it was the thumb version. Well, in all honesty, I have to say that at least one of the thinkers I described might say that's a good idea. Like Emerson might have thought that was preferable to sitting in a classroom. I think that for many people, when you try to have the education only through experience, you wind up just pursuing the experiences that are ready at hand, the things you're most likely to want to do. To take my example, not go to a lecture on Wagner, not encounter physics because you didn't think it was for you, or not develop the skills at writing or quantitative analysis. Now, you might do that. Some people could do that on the road, but very few. So the cost-benefit analysis, I mean, that's pretty clear. Your chances, statistically, it's just a much better investment of your time and money, statistically speaking, to pursue that education. But I don't know that a fine education has to cost $200,000 or $250,000. I do think that it's increasingly the case that public colleges and universities are underfunded, and that private colleges and universities are sucking in dollars because they can. Now, your president, I've not met, but I just read this on the website, did, I think, a courageous thing in freezing tuition next year. And I do think there are paths to holding tuition increases to CPI. I think it's completely possible. We did it the last few years. We held our tuition increases to the consumer price index. It was very low. My treasurer thought this was a great idea because he thought it was going to be going up. So, but we did this, and we could continue to do it in the future. We are not. We're going to raise tuition a little bit more next year. Why? Because all the other schools are doing it, and because And why are they doing it? Because there are wealthy people who will say, I will pay anything so that my little Mikey gets the very best education. And when someone says that, the price always goes up, no matter what you're selling. This was explained to me by Catherine Hill, the president of Vassar. She's an economist. So, so at Wesleyan, and probably like here, there's a lot of people who aren't paying the full fare. There's a lot of financial aid. But I do think that the colleges and universities are now becoming symptoms of economic inequality, catering to the wealthy in ways that continue to drive up the sticker price, and I think it's unhealthy for the system. So the good question, why school rather than experience? Because in today's world, experience alone will not provide you either with the encounters with people you might otherwise not meet and the encounters with methodologies you might not otherwise learn. Yes?
I see a real disconnect between what it is we ask our students to do in a liberal arts environment and what they have been trained to do
yes.
in public education, particularly under a generation of your child.
Yes.
So I wonder if you have anything to say about sort of trying to get students, push students maybe uncomfortable space where there's not the right answer that they have to produce, so that the teacher and the professor gets the pat on the back.
It's a great question. Yeah, it's a great question. We've talked a lot about this at Wesleyan. I had spent before coming back to Wesleyan as president, I had spent the previous almost 25 years in California, where, and some of that at an art school, where we saw a lot less of this than one sees at a liberal arts-oriented institution. And, for all of their schooling, most of our students have been taught to figure out what the professor wants or the teacher wants to hear, what the test taker wants to be told. That's what it means to do well on a test, is to figure out what the test giver wants to be told. And it's the only way to change that behavior is by incentivizing the other kind of behavior. I mean, we could tell our students, as we do, we don't want you to do that, we don't want you to do that, and they think, yeah, right. That's what the test taker always says. The test giver always tells us, we want you to be creative on the SAT. That's why there's an essay, right? What a racket. They're redoing the whole test and they're still required. No one knows what the test will be, and yet they're required. That's a market, right? And that's another story. So I think the creating exercises in the classroom where they're genuinely rewarded for not producing what you expect as a teacher is the key. And to really express authentically, to feel the delight in surprise in the classroom. So I think, there's an interesting thing. So a student, my teachers, my faculty friends, they tell me this all the time, that the students are more conservative. And at the same time, I do feel, and I hope this isn't offending too many people, that many of my faculty colleagues are so used to being an echo chamber of their own that they are shocked that people might say things that other people would be commonplace on Main Street. So we have at Wesleyan, like many schools in the Northeast, everywhere, very little political diversity. The diversity of political opinion is not, there are the Trotskyites and the Leninists, but there's very little, there's not real political diversity in the faculty. So I said this to one of my friends who's in the English department. I said, well, look, we have this poster on like revolution in literature, and look, there's something on race, there's something on class, there's something on gender. See, there's diversity. And he's serious. He actually thinks that that the department is open to other views. What they're open to is a different echo chamber. So how do you, and this is Emerson's complaint from the 19th century, how do you create a possibility bringing new voices into the classroom? At some schools, you bring in people to teach who aren't regular faculty members. on a regular basis. And that can be very exciting for students. They certainly seem to like it. You break the mold. And I think doing that in a way that creates surprises in the classroom is risky, but it can be intellectually exciting, and it can also build community, even if sometimes those surprises generate misunderstanding. So I hope that speaks a little bit to it. Yes?
This is related in some ways to what you're saying, but my idea is a little bit different. There's a contradiction, though, in the way that our educational system is structured for those who go on to be professors, which is that we learn more and more about less and less.
Yes.
There's sort of specialization, such as you see in the medical world as well.
Yeah.
Right? And so the liberal arts ideal of learning from a broad variety, we encourage in our students, and yet the faculty themselves are rewarded for being increasingly narrow.
Yeah.
Right? And so I'm sort of wondering how we, how you see us addressing that kind of contradiction.
It's a great question. The specialization in the academy is antithetical to liberal education, and that's why liberal education has become really distribution requirements in most schools. It's like, I don't really have to know what you're learning over there, just do something over there. Okay? So we don't have to agree, the faculty don't have to agree on what you're going to learn, because we don't really care what you learn. We just want you to be able to say you took something there and here and there. So one of the ways this has been dealt with at Wesleyan, and I think successfully, but for a small number of people, it really started in the 1950s. One of my predecessors, Victor Butterfield, saw this happening in the 50s already, and created interdisciplinary colleges where team teaching was a rule, and where you always taught outside your area of expertise. Some faculty thought this was, the decline of Western civilization, because it was dilettantism, as they said, and instead of modeling learning, which is what he understood. So my wife runs one of these colleges now. It's called the College of Letters, and she's a 19th century comp lit person. She'll teach the medieval colloquium with a medievalist, or the ancient world colloquium with a classicist or a philosopher with a specialty in Plato. And so the students see not expertise, but a trained person learning along with them. I think it's very powerful. It's also very expensive, because you have two teachers in the classroom. Creating incentives for people to work outside their field, creating incentive for people to collaborate with colleagues in different disciplines, really important. We've done this. We had a genius at this at Wesleyan. She's just about to go off to run Jacob's Pillow, a dance organization in the Northeast. She was able to bring a lot of resources to bring scientists to work in the arts. And I think, that's what we need. Scientists trying her hand at painting or his hand at painting, but that's not what it was. It was actually artists and scientists collaborating together in classrooms, and it was fantastic. And she got the best people in science to do it. The people that got the biggest grants, the people everybody respected, and then they choreographed performances that went on the road, and it was very successful. And I think what happens is that you have local incentives for breaking out of the specialization. The real dilemma is that the professional incentives are for specialization. So many faculty members think, I may be teaching at Washington, or I may be teaching at Wesleyan, but my professional allegiance is as a biologist or as an economist or as a historian. That's where I get my professional recognition. And that's a hard thing to struggle against. The good news is that I know the same is probably true here, when you do a search for a new faculty member, you could choose someone who has a different set of values. We tend not to. We tend to choose the same person who would love to have a job at the most specialized research university but can't get one, and so we'll hire them at a place that's oriented towards undergraduate teaching. Instead of saying, no, we actually want someone who will be continually learning and writing or doing experiments, but not just on smaller and smaller topics. Yes?
Yeah, I wonder if linguistic tools can be used. And you know, if I were one of those like Stalinist dictators who could just sort of announce new language, there are a few things that I would do.
Let's hear it. Let's hear it.
Well, first of all, I would banish everybody from using the word kids to refer to students. And I would call them men and women, or they. Some people don't like to be called.
Right, now you'd be in trouble, but we
because that's a marker that, you know, you're in a sort of different place now, you're not in high school. I would also actually banish the word student and start calling people scholars.
Yeah.
Because I think there's a really important distinction between being a student and a scholar. And I researched this a few years ago. And those people here who are my students sort of know about this already, my first years anyway. My scholars, yeah.
Touche. Well, you're a good teacher. He did that on purpose.
I do it. I tell my students in class, let's not use the word interesting, and then always within 5 minutes, I use the word interesting. Anyway.
Even Stalin slept. No.
But I do feel there's a distinction, and that student, if you look at the classical roots of the word, studium actually means sort of hard work, application, and scholar actually derives from leisure and pleasure.
Yeah.
And I feel like there's a big difference there, and scholar to me also says you're on par with your instructors here. You're sort of sitting equally across the table. So I wonder what you think of my modest proposal.
I hate it. No, we would have a disagreement about this because I don't think students or scholars and professors are there for the same reason. I think that for me it's analogous to saying, as a parent, I want to be your friend, my son, my daughter. I'm your parent. Sorry. I could be friendly, but if I'm your friend, that's not my role. I'm not in the same. This course I teach with online things, and Coursera doesn't use the word student; they use the word learner, because they think student is demeaning. I think student is a great thing. I wish I were. I think I am a student in certain things. So I don't mind the word scholar is fine, but I do think it's the difference between the professor and the person who comes there to work with the professor is not erased by linguistics. And so calling attention to the difference sometimes incites rebellion, which is good. But erasing the difference makes students, or students/scholars, feel that we're all in this together, and we're not. I'm grading them. They're not, and they're paying, and I'm getting paid. That's a difference. So this is why I'm a Freudian, that in some ways it's not an equal relation. So let's actually call attention to the inequality and let people rebel against it, rather than to try to erase or conceal the inequality.
Well, luckily I'm not a Stalinist dictator, so I think people are saying.
Well, if I had more authority, Have one more?
Yeah, let's do one more and then we'll.
To me, the liberal education in our four-year colleges is in a way incomplete. We start in the first couple of years looking at life through various lenses: the arts and humanities, the social sciences, the quantitative area. Then we move towards being specific, and even that specificness acquires another narrow specificness within it called the senior capstone experience. And there's a sort of an osmosis happening. To me, the third thing then should be a type of modest denouement at the end of 3.5 years, where there's a senior seminar that freely allows the students with faculty to look at the principal issues that are running around us in 2016, and we are ignoring. This surely is a time of some revolution and danger. And if there was a final seminar which asks them to take that general approach, the specific approach, and then, like John Dewey, bring it back into the classroom, experiences education, Now, I also have to say part of my background coming to this, I'm from the world of the two cultures that C.P. Snow wrote about in the 50s. The world of the liberal arts does not exist in my country or where I was educated. So I have an ideal view that this is an education of sound prophecy, of practical citizenship, of thoughtful, rambunctious citizenship. And if our students don't go out with that, I actually don't think our liberal arts and sciences, and this is in my latter years I'm thinking, I'm saying, are we really liberal?
Yeah, I think that would. Well, I think that your suggestion would be a great improvement. The difficulty is always the case with these kinds of suggestions. Is like, so what would you take out? And we could each think of certain things that we'd gladly sacrifice. But I do think that the ideal is worth holding on to. And at Wesleyan, sometimes these are called pro-seminars. In other words, that they're seniors and in some departments, depending on the intensity of the student demand, the seniors come, and many of the faculty in the department come to that. And I remember vividly that my experience as a senior undergraduate, sitting there with all these professors. It's rather intimidating. Now, in our case, they were arguing around a text, but they were arguing about now. I mean, it wasn't an academic exercise. They were arguing about how this text, Nietzsche in this case, was relevant to what we were seeing in the world. And we saw those teachers they were different because they were with equals and they acted differently with one another than they ever acted with us as individual scholars, students. And so I do think that kind of coming full circle can be really powerful. Sometimes students do it themselves, after dinner or sitting around a coffee house. But I do think schools that manage to bring it back to the world, not as a way of closing it up or tying it up, but as a way of saying, look, this is relevant and there are more questions. That can be very powerful. Did you have a quick question? Because
Very quickly, your forward was describing liberal arts seems to run counter, I think, implicitly so, to the whole very political now, coddling, safe space, trigger warnings, and so forth. And I'd just like your more briefly comment on that.
Sure. So I think that this is the coddling stuff is in some ways a fantasy of middle-aged people who, just don't like young people anymore because they themselves aren't young. I mean, I do think I wrote about this in a couple of places, the Washington Post and a few other places in the fall, that and someone sent me an essay from 1970 by Richard Poirier, a literary critic, called "The War Against the Young," and it was so similar. It was so similar, criticizing the generation who was coming of age in 1969, 1970, for being, just selfish and irrelevant and not facing up to reality and, unrealistic idea. And it was some of the same resentment, I think. There are ways in which our students, and especially their parents, are trying to shield young folks from experience. That happens. I think it may happen more now than when I was at school. And it might happen more now because of the economic conditions being so different. When I was graduating, and there were no jobs going to graduate school, people said it was folly if I thought I was going to become a professor. There were no jobs in intellectual history. There was one in the year I finished in the country, in my field. And, but my father said, well, if you got a scholarship, you could try, and then if you don't get it, you can drive a cab. My uncle is a cab driver. We'll fix you up. There was a way of making enough money to live on. And I think partly because it's so expensive, and partly because the middle class has been hollowed out through the changes in the economy, that option is very frightening to people. They think if they don't really make it, then they really will suffer. And that middling thing is less obvious. So parents are worried about that. I find that our students, although there is some language of safe spaces and all, I find on the whole that they are trying to wrestle with these massive changes that they know better than most people my age that the climate change is going to completely change the ways in which we live and will decimate whole societies around the globe. They know that economic inequality has become a defining feature of the world in ways that, Bernie is talking about, but very few other people are talking in the same way. I mean, they do know these things. They're incredibly frightening and challenging issues. And I respect their effort to work on them. They have what my grandmother would call mishigas. They have this kind of this crazy silliness about certain things, I think, therapy puppies for finals and things like that. But, when I think back on the stuff that I did as a senior, that, that my teachers did when they were students, I'm not so worried about their resiliency. I'm worried about the problems we're leaving them. And I think education was their best hope to confront those problems. So thank you very much for coming. And there's food.